Welcome back to our channel. Today we're diving into the incredible story of one of the most powerful families of the Renaissance era, the Medici. Rising from humble beginnings in Florence's wool trade to becoming the bankers of Europe with a staggering fortune, equivalent to $129 billion today. The Medici family was the hidden hand controlling politics, religion, and the arts. They patronized legendary artists like Michelangelo and Botticelli, produced 4 renowned popes, and orchestrated clandestine schemes that shook the city of Florence to its core. Join me as we peel back the layers of this remarkable dynasty and uncover why their brilliance earned them worldwide admiration, even as the shadows of their secret intrigues continue to send shivers through history. Let me take you on a journey back to Florence in the late 15th century, when the grandeur of the Italian Renaissance was in full bloom, but a dramatic and bloody plot threatened to topple one of the most influential families in all of Europe. Picture this. It's Easter Sunday, 1478. The great cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, commonly referred to as the Duomo, is filled with solemn worshippers, the Medici brothers Giuliano and Lorenzo among them. Florence at that time was a proud republic, but effectively dominated by the Medici family, whose banking empire and political savvy had made them de facto rulers of the city. Then, in a moment no one saw coming, at least not the ordinary Florentines, a group of conspirators led by the rival Pazzi family and backed by none other than Pope Sixtus IV himself, launches a brutal assassination attempt inside one of the holiest spaces in Christendom. Giuliano de' Medici falls under the conspirators' knives, bleeding to death on the cathedral floor, while Lorenzo, famously known as the Magnificent, fights them off and narrowly escapes with a wound. What follows is not only the swift elimination of these rebels, but also a merciless wave of reprisals that echoes through history as one of the bloodiest chapters of Renaissance intrigue. You might have heard of the Pazzi conspiracy in passing, perhaps from historical dramas, from references in well-known newspapers, or from brief mentions in tourist guides to Florence, but the scale and savagery of the events that followed are sometimes glossed over, eclipsed by the shining legacy of Lorenzo de' Medici as the great patron of the arts, the man who nurtured the genius of Michelangelo and Botticelli, the political mind who shaped Florence into the cultural capital of the Renaissance. What many sources, including the New York Times and major history outlets, reveal is that after the plot was foiled, Lorenzo moved swiftly and ruthlessly against everyone even tangentially involved in the conspiracy. It is said that over 80 conspirators were executed in various gruesome ways: public hangings, decapitations, dismemberments, and other forms of brutality meant to send a loud, terrifying message. No one challenges the Medici and survives unscathed. The remarkable thing is how most of this violence remained largely hushed in official narratives for centuries, presumably to preserve Lorenzo's legacy as the benevolent, magnificent ruler, patron of the arts, and father of a cultural golden age. In fact, if you search through records discussed by modern blogs and historians, or dig up references in Wikipedia's articles on the Pazzi conspiracy, you'll see glimpses of how that systematic campaign of retaliation was overshadowed by the more appealing stories of Lorenzo's patronage, diplomacy, and poetic pursuits. But the darkest side of that Easter Sunday is integral to understanding why the Medici remained in power and how Florence, for better or worse, was shaped by violence as well as art and commerce. Contemporary accounts from Florentine trial records, some of which have been analyzed by historians who've written in journals and on specialized history blogs, indicate that Lorenzo kept a meticulous eye on punishing those who had a hand in organizing the plot. People often note that the conspiracy extended beyond the Pazzi family itself. There were clerics involved, members of the Salviati family. The Archbishop of Pisa at the time was said to be involved in the plot, and other men of influence. Pope Sixtus IV was widely viewed as complicit because of his political ambitions in Tuscany. The Pope had bestowed favors on the Pazzi and was frustrated with the Medici's hold on Florence's affairs. One wonders how a pope, holding the highest spiritual authority in Christendom, could so thoroughly entangle himself in an assassination conspiracy, yet that was the political climate of the Renaissance. The papacy was mired in nepotism, financial intrigue, and unabashed power grabs. According to Encyclopedia Britannica and other reputable sources, Sixtus IV was notorious for placing family members in significant positions of power, which perhaps is why he wholeheartedly supported the Pazzi, who might have promised him greater autonomy or financial advantage in managing Florence. The day of the conspiracy, known in some historical circles as the Easter Massacre, is frequently compared by modern scholars to other infamous events of dynastic murder, such as the disappearance of the Plantagenet princes in the Tower in England. In that chilling 15th century episode, the young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, were presumed murdered in the Tower of London. The difference, of course, is that the princes in the Tower were never seen again, leaving a haunting mystery that continues to fascinate and horrify. In the case of the Pazzi conspiracy, the violence took place in broad daylight, in the middle of a religious service, ensuring that all of Florence bore witness to the bloodshed. It was an open affront to the sanctity of the city's spiritual life, turning that year's Easter Sunday into a day of profound shock for the populace. What's equally fascinating is that the immediate aftermath involved a kind of frenzy among Florentines loyal to the Medici, as well as those who were simply horrified by the desecration of such a sacred space. Eyewitness reports, some of which survive in letters, diaries, and official communications, describe how conspirators were seized right on the spot or hunted down in the days that followed, summarily tried, and then subjected to brutal punishments. Public hangings took place from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria, now called the Palazzo Vecchio. In some accounts, bodies of the executed were left hanging as an explicit warning to anyone else considering stirring up trouble. Historians and articles in reputable newspapers, including commentary from the New York Times, highlight that the scale of executions might have been as high as 80 individuals. A few were beheaded, some drawn and quartered, and others had their limbs mutilated in the public squares. Grisly forms of retribution intended to quell all future threats against the Medici. Now, modern historians and popular writers alike have questioned just how personally involved Lorenzo de' Medici was in the killing spree. In many official sources of the time, Lorenzo's involvement is either downplayed or omitted altogether, fueling the idea that the blame was strategically shifted onto his supporters or local magistrates or the outraged Florentine mobs. The goal presumably was to keep Lorenzo's carefully cultivated image, one of generosity, learning, and refinement, intact. He was, after all, Lorenzo the Magnificent, champion of the arts, friend to great thinkers like Pico della Mirandola, sponsor to architects like Giuliano da Sangallo, and poet in his own right. Modern discussions like those on academic websites or in some well-researched blogs reflect that while the existence of a massive wave of reprisals is indisputable, the claim that Lorenzo personally swung the sword or lit the pyre remains speculative. We have documented evidence of the plot itself and the subsequent purge, but we lack conclusive evidence that Lorenzo personally did the killing. Some have tried to pin direct responsibility on him. Others caution that while he likely ordered or tacitly approved these actions, we can't prove he was physically present at every execution. Regardless of whether Lorenzo wielded the blade himself, the underlying fact is that he led the city's leadership in a relentless crackdown. It's important to note that Florence was by no means a place of unblemished democracy or gentle rule, even though we remember it for the blossoming of artistic genius, Botticelli's Primavera, Michelangelo's David, and the exquisite dome engineered by Brunelleschi. A sense of precariousness and brutality lurked beneath the surface. The social media of the Renaissance, if we can call it that, was word of mouth, proclamations, rumors, and public theatrics. Lorenzo, a master of political theater, understood that to remain in power, he had to show unyielding strength. Thus, orchestrating and overseeing these reprisals was as much a public performance of dominance as it was an administration of justice. In many ways, the events following the assassination attempt marked a turning point, sometimes described by modern historians as the Easter Massacre that saved the Medici. Giuliano's death was a tragic blow to the family, but Lorenzo emerged from the ordeal even more powerful than before. In a historical parallel, some note how the death of a well-regarded family member, Giuliano was beloved by many for his amiable nature, prompted the city to rally around the surviving brother. Fear, anger, and the desire for stability all converged to place Florence more firmly under Lorenzo's control. From that moment forward, he was regarded not only as the figurehead of Florentine culture and finance, but also as the man who had survived a brazen conspiracy and demonstrated the ruthlessness necessary to protect the city-state from internal and external threats. Florence wasn't just any city at this time. It was a hub of trade, banking, and artistic innovation. The Medici Bank, established by Giovanni de' Medici and later expanded under Cosimo, quickly rose to dominate European finance by skillfully juggling international accounts, facilitating currency exchanges, and forging political alliances through loans. The Medici turned their bank into a powerhouse. As you might see mentioned in Wikipedia entries on the House of Medici or in blog posts discussing the first multinational bank, it was considered one of the most sophisticated financial institutions of its era. Yet these accolades barely scratch the surface when it comes to the kinds of behind-the-scenes deals the Medici were capable of. One of the most explosive assertions detailed in works like The Medici, Power, Money, and Ambition, and occasionally touched upon in articles from major newspapers, alleges that the Medici Bank siphoned profits directly from papal accounts in the 15th century. The accusation is that Cosimo and his associates manipulated the books, marking down or hiding certain revenues owed to the church, then quietly funneling them back to Florence to fund projects that would enrich the Medici and burnish their reputation. These alleged under-the-table transfers helped pay for not just new architectural endeavors or charitable contributions, but also the lavish patronage of artists and intellectuals who made Florence the envy of Europe. The theory is that these artistic achievements, which we admire to this day in museums and cathedrals, were financed in part by misdirected funds that technically belonged to the papacy. Now, if you're wondering how the Medici Bank gained the power to manage the papacy's money, it's important to note that in the 15th century, the Pope was not only a spiritual leader, but also a temporal ruler involved in constant political maneuvers. The Papal States needed a steady cash flow for administrative costs, mercenary armies, construction projects, and all the other demands of a Renaissance power player. Major families like the Medici vied for the privilege of managing the papacy's financial affairs because it was a direct pipeline to enormous wealth and influence. The prestige of being the bank of the Pope also conferred a quasi-sacred aura. After all, if you were handling the money of God's representative on earth, you had to be trustworthy, right? But trust in the Renaissance world was a malleable concept, and the lines between faithful stewardship and outright exploitation could blur if the parties involved had enough cunning. Cosimo de' Medici, successor to Giovanni and effectively the family patriarch by the 1430s, showed remarkable brilliance in both diplomacy and subterfuge. Historians recount how Cosimo built webs of alliances, not only through marriage but also through carefully timed loans, political favors, and strategic forgiveness of debts. He understood that controlling the Pope's purse strings placed him in a prime position to influence policies or elections within the Church. One rumor suggests he even financed certain cardinals in the papal conclave to ensure they were favorable to Florentine interests. According to the Medici Power, Money, and Ambition, one of the most telling aspects of this alleged siphoning was how it stayed concealed within the Medici family chronicles. Many official documents from the era present Cosimo and his successors as devout Catholics who would never dream of cheating the papacy. In reality, if the rumors are to be believed, it wasn't just a dream. It was a well-coordinated operation. The reason for this careful concealment was clear. If discovered, Cosimo risked not just the Pope's wrath, but the very real threat of excommunication, which at that time could be a death sentence for your social and political life. The Pope had the power to declare you a heretic, sever your ties to the Church, and cast you into a kind of spiritual and civic exile. For a banker whose every business deal depended on personal alliances and trust, excommunication would be catastrophic. Yet the family chronicles apparently downplayed this risk, painting a picture of harmonious relations between the Medici and the papacy. One can imagine well-paid scribes or historians in the Medici court either glossing over or conveniently omitting the more dubious arrangements in order to preserve the family's saintly veneer. The official narrative, found in certain curated archives, might describe how close Cosimo was to the Pope, how he sponsored religious events or donated to build churches. Meanwhile, the rumored ledger, manipulations that quietly diverted profits to Florence, were left out or buried so deeply that only the occasional annotation hints at the broader scheme. If you take a trip to Florence's archives or even the Vatican libraries, you'll find references to these alleged irregularities. Some modern historians and researchers, cited on specialized academic blogs, point to discrepancies in account books that don't quite match up. One recurring suspicion is that certain transactions labeled as fees or banking commissions were inflated to funnel sums into Medici-controlled accounts. Another suspicion arises when you compare interest rates reported in papal records with those in surviving Medici bank ledgers. A mismatch could indicate that the bank was shaving off a bit more than it should have. But the problem is that many of these records are incomplete, lost, or intentionally destroyed over time. So while the allegations of fraud are not new, they've been whispered about for generations, the details remain sparse, making it an enduring mystery that blends into the broader tapestry of Medici intrigue. It's worth drawing a parallel here to more modern financial scandals. Think, for instance, of how the Hearst media empire faced scrutiny for alleged business entanglements that some claim involved Nazi money prior to World War II, an accusation that remains murky in specifics, but has stirred debate among historians and ethicists. Or consider DuPont's well-documented struggles with the PFOA cover-up, in which they were accused of downplaying the harmful effects of a chemical used in Teflon production to protect corporate profits. In both modern cases, we see how influential companies sometimes go to great lengths to conceal certain practices to preserve their power and reputation. The alleged Medici Bank siphoning scandal fits neatly into this pattern of corporate misbehavior, though in a medieval sense, where the formidable might of a brand, in this case, the Medici name, compels those involved to bury the evidence of wrongdoing. And yet, as with these modern parallels, some might say the rumor of massive papal embezzlement by the Medici is overblown. Skeptics, including certain historians, caution that while financial mischief surely happened, it was the norm in Renaissance banking. There's no concrete proof of a huge, orchestrated, monstrous scheme to loot the papal treasury. They argue that the banking system of the period was chaotic, with poor bookkeeping standards compared to modern times. In that environment, missing funds or ambiguous ledger entries don't necessarily indicate a grand conspiracy. They could be due to incompetent record keeping, local corruption at lower levels, or even currency fluctuations that were poorly understood. So while fraud is documented, as some sources note, the leap from noticing suspicious discrepancies to declaring a massive systematic theft could be a stretch. That said, it's fascinating to note how the Medici used their bank's resources to transform Florence into a city of unparalleled artistic splendor. If you walk through the city, the evidence is everywhere. The majestic dome of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, the hauntingly beautiful sculptures by Donatello, or the intricate frescoes that grace numerous churches. Funding for these masterpieces in part came from Medici wealth that was intertwined with papal finances. Now, does that mean every brushstroke, every chiseled stone, was indirectly paid for by the Pope's money? Not necessarily, but it does raise the question. If the papacy had known how much of its own funds were purportedly being diverted, would we still have the same Florence we admire today? Or would the Pope have severed relations with the Medici, diminishing their capacity to sponsor such large-scale cultural projects? Cosimo de' Medici, often credited as the founder of the Medici political dynasty, was no fool when it came to maintaining loyalty among cardinals or other high-ranking church officials. Historical accounts show that he routinely extended lines of credit to various churchmen, sometimes at favorable interest rates, a gesture that bought him a reputation as a benefactor. In the highly hierarchical world of the church, such moves could ensure that if eyebrows were raised about the bank's handling of papal funds, they wouldn't be raised too high. Cosimo's ability to grease the wheels of Vatican bureaucracy through carefully placed generosity might have been the most significant factor keeping any major investigation at bay. A cardinal with a healthy credit line at the Medici Bank might think twice before accusing that same bank of fraud. Naturally, Cosimo's successors like Piero the Guti and eventually Lorenzo the Magnificent inherited the same precarious balancing act. Preserve close ties to the papacy, leverage those ties for financial gain, but avoid drawing too much attention to irregularities. While Lorenzo is often celebrated for his cultural patronage and statesmanship, some researchers speculate that the hidden legacy of Cosimo's earlier dealings with the papacy provided a crucial financial backbone that allowed Lorenzo to be so extravagant in his support for the arts. Again, we encounter that intangible fog of missing records and contradictory accounts. A single ledger might tell you only what the clerk or banker chose to write down on a given day, especially in an era long before standardized auditing practices existed. If we imagine the day-to-day operations of a Renaissance-era banking house, we see high-stakes deals being made in candlelit chambers, with ledgers maintained by scribes who could be easily bribed or threatened. Cross-referencing these documents centuries later is like trying to piece together a puzzle when half of the pieces might have been burned in a fireplace. Some contemporary letters do surface, perhaps from ambassadors in Florence who were suspicious, or from certain priests who noticed the sums arriving at the papal treasury didn't match what the Medici bank reported. But these letters often speak in vague terms or remain silent about the culprit. Few were eager to accuse someone as powerful as Cosimo of foul play without a rock-solid case. Hence, the direct documentary evidence is sparse, leaving modern historians to rely on circumstantial clues, financial irregularities, and the contradictory claims of both supporters and enemies of the Medici. A typical scenario is that an entry in the papal books might show a deposit of, say, 10,000 florins, while the Medici bank's ledger for the same transaction states 9,000 florins, an unexplained shortfall. Multiply that discrepancy by dozens or hundreds of transactions, and you could have a tidy profit flowing into Medici projects. But these are just the scraps of paper that survived. Who knows how many pages were lost, how many were deliberately doctored, or how many transactions were carried out entirely off the books? According to some modern-day blogs that focus on Renaissance finance, discovering a single piece of conclusive evidence, like a letter from Cosimo instructing an official to falsify numbers, would be a seismic event in Medici scholarship. But to date, that smoking gun has never been found. Catherine was married to King Henry II, and after his death in a jousting accident, she became the mother of 3 successive French kings, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, each of whom ascended the throne at a young age, leaving Catherine in a unique position of power. Effectively, she was the regent of France, or at least the driving force behind the monarchy, navigating an era racked by the French wars of religion, a devastating conflict between Catholics and Huguenots that had already ravaged the country. By the summer of 1572, Catherine believed that a grand alliance, a royal wedding between her daughter Margaret of Valois and the Huguenot leader Henry of Navarre, might bring peace to the realm. That wedding was supposed to unite Catholic and Protestant factions and put an end to years of bloodshed. As The Guardian and other reputable sources have pointed out in their historical retrospectives, there was genuine hope among many observers that this union might calm tensions, or at the very least, create a political compromise. The Huguenots, led by influential figures like Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, were no small force. They could not be easily suppressed without risking a protracted civil war. But behind the gilded facade of the royal court, things were more precarious than they appeared. Just days after the wedding, an assassination attempt was made on Admiral Coligny, a staunch Protestant commander, and a man who had gained considerable influence over King Charles IX. Though the assassination failed, Coligny was badly wounded, and rumors of who might have orchestrated the attempt ran wild. Many Huguenots suspected the Guise family, a powerful Catholic faction at court, or possibly even Catherine herself, who reportedly felt uneasy about Coligny's growing sway over her son. Tensions escalated rapidly as prominent Huguenots demanded an investigation while Catholics braced for potential reprisals. Then came August 24th, the Feast of St. Bartholomew. In the early morning hours, soldiers and armed citizens began a systematic slaughter of prominent Huguenot leaders, a violent chain reaction that spiraled into full-scale mob violence throughout Paris. Streets were soaked in blood, houses were raided, and men, women, and children were indiscriminately killed in scenes so horrific that some accounts read like something out of a nightmare. Over the next several days, the violence spread to other French towns, and Huguenots across the kingdom found themselves hunted and attacked. Modern historians estimate that the death toll may have ranged from 2,000 to 3,000 in Paris alone, and possibly up to 10,000 or more when counting other regions. For centuries, Catherine de' Medici's name has been darkly enshrined in this narrative. The question is whether she merely allowed the violence to happen or actually planned it. According to multiple French archives, including some of Catherine's letters, the Queen Mother was not taken entirely by surprise when events unfolded that night. In fact, as researchers have uncovered, her private correspondence suggests she was heavily involved in shaping the decision to eliminate certain high-ranking Protestants, namely those who posed the greatest threat to her power and the monarchy's stability. These letters, some of which remain preserved in archives such as the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, show Catherine discussing necessary measures to address what she believed was an imminent Protestant conspiracy against the crown. While the language can be cryptic, several historians interpret her words as more than a defensive stance. Instead, they see an intent to strike first. This viewpoint is bolstered by contemporary Huguenot accounts that strongly condemn Catherine as the mastermind. Protestant pamphleteers wasted little time printing lurid descriptions of her meddling and her Italian cunning, claiming she orchestrated the killings and then deftly pinned most of the blame on popular unrest. Such pamphlets often depicted her as a shadowy figure pulling the strings of an easily manipulated young king, Charles IX, who was in his early 20s at the time. Henry of Navarre, who would later become King Henry IV, was one of the few Huguenot leaders to survive. He had, in fact, been coerced into renouncing his Protestant faith to avoid execution, a decision he would famously reverse some years later. Catherine, for her part, tried to distance herself from the unfolding horror. Official statements from the royal court pinned much of the blame on the Parisians' righteous wrath against Protestant rebels, or at least that's how the monarchy spun it. In some declarations, the crown suggested that local mobs acted spontaneously out of fear that the Huguenots were preparing a coup, but the speed, scale, and orchestration of the massacre imply more than just a spontaneous mob. Many historians today see that argument as flimsy and note that the initial wave of killings targeted Huguenot leaders quite specifically, suggesting a degree of planning that went beyond mere rumor or happenstance. It seems unlikely that an uncoordinated crowd would just happen to strike simultaneously at key Protestant nobles and officers lodged in different quarters of the city, a parallel that helps illuminate Catherine's possible motivations can be found far from Renaissance France in the annals of early Islamic history, particularly the Umayyad dynasty's approach to power consolidation. The Umayyads, ruling from Damascus in the 7th and 8th centuries, often strengthened their grip by eliminating potential rivals, sometimes swiftly and brutally. Modern scholars make the comparison to emphasize how rulers in precarious positions, especially with religious divides at play, could resort to planned mass killings to neutralize threats. While Catherine's scenario was couched in the specifics of the French Wars of Religion, the underlying logic might have been quite similar. Better to destroy a perceived threat now than risk a catastrophic civil conflict later. The resulting violence might look chaotic from the outside, but behind the scenes, the orchestrators understand exactly what they're setting in motion. If we explore Catherine's letters in detail, we find repeated references to concerns about Huguenot plots, especially after Admiral Coligny began advocating for French intervention in the Netherlands against Catholic Spain. a policy that Catherine feared could drag France into more war and weaken the monarchy's stability. Some letters, quoted in historical blogs dedicated to the French wars of religion, hint that Catherine was worried Charles IX might be swayed entirely by the Admiral's counsel. She felt threatened, not just personally, but in her role as the Queen Mother trying to maintain equilibrium in a religiously fractured kingdom. Another complicating factor was the Guise family, strong Catholic allies who wanted revenge against Coligny for earlier conflicts. From Catherine's perspective, if civil war was inevitable, perhaps it was wiser to eliminate the Protestant leadership in a single decisive blow. Yet for all the accusations directed at her, Catherine's precise involvement remains a subject of debate. Reputable modern historians, such as those cited in the Encyclopedia Britannica, emphasize that while Catherine almost certainly gave the royal green light for the initial purge of Huguenot nobles, the subsequent explosion of mob violence might not have been entirely in her control. Once the first shots were fired, sometimes quite literally, the populace of Paris, already inflamed by years of religious animosity, took matters into its own hands, killing Protestants indiscriminately. Catherine may have intended a targeted strike against a few key individuals, but ended up unleashing a much larger wave of terror. In that sense, Catherine's attempts to shift blame onto the angry populace might be partially true, in that no single figure could single-handedly orchestrate mob fury that spread across multiple French cities. However, it's undeniable that her decision, and likely her urging of Charles IX, set the stage for that fury to explode. Adding to the swirling controversies around Catherine de' Medici are the persistent claims of her involvement with witchcraft or occult practices, allegations that often appear in older histories or sensationalist accounts. Some stories depict her employing fortune tellers, astrologers, and poison makers in secret chambers of the Louvre, concocting sinister potions or curses against her enemies. Contemporary anti-Medici propaganda often depicted her as an Italian poisoner queen, drawing from stereotypes about Italians being masters of the dark arts. According to most serious historians today, these witchcraft accusations are without credible foundation. They likely stemmed from xenophobic attitudes toward Catherine's Florentine origins and from the widespread fear and confusion after the massacre. One or two references in diaries from the period might mention suspicious potions or Catherine consulting astrologers like Cosimo Ruggeri, but there is no solid evidence that she literally practiced witchcraft or conjured dark spirits to bring about the massacre. Nevertheless, those rumors contributed to Catherine's reputation as a cruel manipulator, overshadowing whatever more pragmatic or political motivations she had for her actions. Even respected historians of the 19th century sometimes echoed these claims without much scrutiny. The result is that Catherine has often been caricatured as a near demonic figure, overshadowing the fact that she was operating in a context where monarchs, male or female, routinely faced moral dilemmas about how to handle religious factions that threatened the stability of the state. In that sense, Catherine might be judged harshly because of the staggering body count of St. Bartholomew's Day. But the basic strategy of eliminating political or religious adversaries was far from unique to her. Rulers throughout history, from the Umayyads to the Roman emperors, engaged in preemptive purges to stay in power. What makes Catherine's story so compelling, however, is that she did it all as a queen mother, a female power behind the throne in a time when public authority was overwhelmingly male. If the king himself had orchestrated these killings, we might see him in the same light as some of the more ruthless monarchs of Europe. But because Catherine was a mother, and because she was Italian in a French court, the narrative became even more sensational. People whispered about her Italian blood fueling her cunning, about her unscrupulous methods to preserve her children's rule, and about how a mother figure could so callously preside over mass murder. Yet Catherine was never simply a background figure. From the moment Henry II died, she knew her children's thrones could only be secured by artful negotiation, alliances, and occasionally severe measures against enemies. Indeed, the French wars of religion had led to the deaths of tens of thousands on both sides. In such a violent environment, Catherine might have concluded that peace could only be won by a show of overwhelming force. This complexity leads some scholars to a nuanced interpretation of her role. They argue that Catherine was neither a saint nor a devil, but rather a stateswoman grappling with an impossible situation. From this angle, the massacre was a catastrophic miscalculation. She intended to remove a handful of Protestant ringleaders, but unwittingly unleashed a mob that wouldn't stop until rivers of blood ran through the streets of Paris. The Queen Mother found herself caught in the aftermath, perhaps horrified by the scale of the violence, but also compelled to defend the monarchy's narrative, that it was all an unfortunate outburst of popular anger rather than a carefully orchestrated operation. After all, any open admission of responsibility would have invited retribution from Protestant powers in Europe, or even from moderate Catholics who might blame the crown for turning Paris into a slaughterhouse. It's no secret that personal relationships were often leveraged in the Renaissance for political gain. Marriages, sealed alliances, and even extramarital affairs could be manipulated to forge new connections or placate old rivals. According to various Florentine histories, Cosimo and Lorenzo de' Medici were said to have integrated rumored illegitimate children into the family fold, all to broaden the Medici network of influence. This was a time when your bloodline determined your fortunes, and so acknowledging, or pretending to acknowledge, certain heirs could mean the difference between survival and downfall for a noble family. Of course, the flip side was that too many rumors of illegitimacy might tarnish the family name. In an era where the church wielded enormous power, any public scandal risked excommunication or at least a serious blow to one's reputation. To circumvent such dangers, births were sometimes obscured in church records, or else explained away in official genealogies that conveniently forgot certain dates, times, or mothers. One of the prime examples often cited is Alessandro de' Medici. Many historical sources, including academic papers and curated blog posts, note that Alessandro's paternity remains somewhat murky. There's strong speculation he was an illegitimate child, quite possibly Cosimo's, and that the Medici quietly legitimatized him to stave off controversy. Alessandro de' Medici, who eventually rose to become the Duke of Florence, stands out in part because of his mixed heritage. Some accounts even suggest that his mother might have been of African descent, which would have been exceedingly unusual for a Florentine noble in that era. Though not all historians agree on every detail, there's an undeniable undercurrent of secrecy surrounding his birth. Quiet legitimization meant the hush-hush recognition of a child who, under different circumstances, might have been banished to obscurity. Instead, the Medici recognized Alessandro at least enough to allow him a significant stake in their political future. These hush-hush genealogical manipulations by the Medici are reminiscent of similar stories throughout history, where powerful families chose to incorporate clandestine offspring for strategic advantage. If you look at modern parallels, you might recall rumors about William Randolph Hearst, the American newspaper magnate who, according to persistent gossip, mentioned in certain unauthorized biographies and blog posts, might have had a secret daughter whose existence was never publicly acknowledged. Another often cited example is the case of a Guggenheim family member rumored to have had an affair aboard the Titanic. Stories that swirl with half-truths, diaries, and coded references in old letters. While these examples are separated by centuries and continents, the pattern is consistent. Powerful people sometimes keep quiet about their children when acknowledging them might be inconvenient or scandalous. But behind closed doors, they might still bring those children into the fold if it served their wider interests. The Medici, who prided themselves on their lineage and their close ties to the church, couldn't afford open scandals that might tarnish their image. Considering that the family's power in Florence often relied on delicate balancing acts with the papacy, keeping any whiff of illegitimacy under wraps was crucial. Excommunication in the 15th or 16th century was no small matter. It could mean the severing of political alliances, the freezing of financial assets, and the potential downfall of your entire house. A few carefully placed bribes or quiet deals with local clerics might ensure the relevant baptisms were recorded under slightly modified names, or that mention of the father was left vague. With enough resources, any record might be lost or misplaced. Anyone suspicious or curious enough to question these events would have a hard time proving wrongdoing in an era long before standardized identity documents or DNA testing. Moreover, the secrecy around illegitimate Medici heirs didn't just serve to protect the family's image. It could also be a valuable tool for forging alliances. In Renaissance Italy, having an extra son or daughter who could be quietly introduced into a marriage arrangement provided the family with unexpected leverage. Suppose a neighboring duchy needed a new alliance, or a certain bishop had a niece or nephew in need of a marriage partner. In such situations, the Medici might bring forth a child who, though not officially recorded in the genealogies, could be retroactively acknowledged if it suited them. This cloak-and-dagger approach to dynastic expansion gave the Medici remarkable flexibility in a political landscape where deals could shift from day to day. Yet, it's important not to get carried away by the drama. While Alessandro's illegitimacy appears plausible, backed by a fair amount of circumstantial evidence, broader claims that the Medici had swarms of hidden bastards lurking in the Florentine shadows are probably overblown. Academic historians frequently caution that rumors of widespread bastards can become exaggerated, especially when a powerful family's enemies wish to smear their name. Court gossips love nothing more than a juicy scandal, and many an old letter or memoir recounted shocking claims of unacknowledged heirs without offering concrete proof. Some diaries or personal notes from that period mention suspicious resemblances. A stable boy who looked uncannily like a certain nobleman, a servant girl who was showered with suspiciously generous gifts. But these anecdotes rarely amount to genuine historical evidence. So how do we sift through centuries of rumors to find facts? One way is to search for anomalies in baptismal records, or to track the mention of unusual wards or distant relatives who seem inexplicably close to the family. On occasion, 18th and 19th century antiquarians in Florence compiled genealogical treatises that tried to map out every known branch of the Medici clan. Some of these documents, though incomplete, contain marginal notes about births that didn't fit the official timeline or references to children of uncertain origin. A few dedicated researchers, as recorded in specialized history blogs, have pored over these lists, cross-referencing them with property transfers or dowry records to see if they can spot a hidden pattern. While this detective work rarely yields smoking gun evidence, it can highlight suspicious gaps or contradictory statements. anything from multiple births recorded on suspiciously close dates to references to a child who disappeared from the family chronicle. For Alessandro in particular, scholars have zeroed in on official court documents that recognized him as a Medici heir. According to some references in the state archives in Florence, there was a sudden acknowledgement of Alessandro's status that allowed him to take on increasing political responsibilities. No official statement said, yes, this is Cosimo's or Lorenzo's bastard, but the abruptness of his inclusion into the line of succession is telling. Additionally, ambassadors from other Italian states wrote letters back home, some of which have survived, commenting on the surprising prominence of a young man whose paternity was unclear. In a world of rampant intrigue, many quietly accepted that Alessandro must have been an illegitimate Medici, whose lineage had been formally recognized behind the scenes. The quiet legitimization of an heir also stands as a hallmark of the carefully choreographed dance that the Medici performed with the Catholic Church. Technically, the Church frowned upon illegitimate births, and legitimizing someone born outside of marriage could be complicated. Yet the Medici had long-standing ties to the papacy. Recall that Pope Leo X and Pope Clement VII were themselves Medici. Though Alessandro predated some of these papal family connections, the family's broader relationship with Rome often opened doors that would remain closed to lesser families. A bishop or cardinal might give special dispensations for a wayward child if in return the Medici Bank financed a church project or offered political support in a power struggle within the papal states. It was the typical Renaissance exchange. You scratch my back and I'll discreetly alter these records to remove any mention of your child's scandalous origins. This phenomenon was not exclusive to the Medici. Take, for instance, the Borgias, a family equally entrenched in accusations of having illegitimate offspring and forging official documents. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, famously recognized his children, Cesare and Lucrezia, because not to do so would have undercut his entire family's standing. All across Renaissance Europe, from Spanish grandees to German electors, rumors of secret heirs abounded. The difference with the Medici is how systematically they seem to weave these children into their power matrix. Some historians argue this skill was part of why the Medici endured so long, outlasting many rival families that were just as ambitious but less adept at covering their tracks. If you want a parallel from more recent times, Hearst's alleged secret daughter or the Guggenheim Titanic affair provide interesting contrast. William Randolph Hearst, if some stories are to be believed, financially supported a daughter he never publicly acknowledged in order to preserve his media empire's squeaky clean facade. Meanwhile, certain members of the Guggenheim family have been the subject of talk about hush-hush children conceived just before or during the Titanic's doomed voyage. While there's no definitive proof in either case, and much is pure speculation, the parallels to the Medici story show that wealthy dynasties across the centuries have often engaged in similar patterns of public denial and private acceptance when it comes to illegitimate heirs. The difference is that the Medici's fortunes were closely tied to the unstable politics of an entire city-state, so every decision to recognize or conceal a child had ripple effects beyond personal scandal. These decisions could shift alliances, provoke jealousies, or incite vendettas. Indeed, vendettas were a constant threat in Renaissance Italy. Let's say Cosimo fathered a child with a woman whose family was connected to one of the Medici's sworn enemies. If the child was publicly recognized, that might either pacify the rival family, because they had a blood tie to the Medici now, or inflame them further, because they felt the circumstances shamed their daughter or tarnish their name. As a result, the family might respond with lethal force. Historians sometimes credit the Medici's cunning, not just for their calculated marriages, but also for how they navigated the potential landmines of acknowledging illegitimate offspring. A wrong move could have ended in swords drawn and daggers unsheathed in dark alleys. Furthermore, in a city like Florence, which prized civic identity and had complex republican traditions, a family that overreached its power risked backlash from the citizenry. The Medici were widely known as de facto rulers, but they still had to pretend they were merely prominent citizens. It's easy to see how multiple rumors of illegitimate children swirling around the clan might have tarnished their carefully curated image of respectability. That's why so many documents dealing with these potential heirs were kept from public scrutiny. A broadening circle of Medici bastards would only stoke the fires of criticism, especially among Republican-minded Florentines who disliked the Medici's quasi-princely status. In 1492, when Lorenzo de' Medici dies, Lorenzo, for all his cultured patronage of the arts, supporting figures like Botticelli and Michelangelo, had effectively dominated Florence's political stage through a delicate combination of shrewd diplomacy, financial power, and paternalistic governance. His death creates a power vacuum. Into that gap steps his son, Piero de' Medici, sometimes called Piero the Unfortunate. Piero, lacking his father's touch, stumbles into foreign policy disasters and alienates key factions in the city. Around the same time, Girolamo Savonarola's sermons start drawing ever larger crowds at the Church of San Marco. In them, he warns that Florence must cleanse itself of vice or face divine wrath. According to diaries kept by contemporaries, some of which are discussed in academic blogs and gleaned from local Florentine archives, Savonarola's proclamations resonate deeply with many Florentines who feel that corruption and decadence have become rampant under Medici domination. Then in 1494, the French King Charles VIII invades Italy, claiming rights to the Kingdom of Naples. As the French armies approach Florence, Piero de' Medici attempts to negotiate, but ends up essentially surrendering key fortresses to Charles. Outraged Florentines see Piero's capitulation as both humiliating and reckless. Sensing the rising fury, Savonarola positions himself not only as a moral voice, but also as a political figure who insists that Florence must rely on God's grace rather than the favor of kings. The result is that Piero de' Medici is forced into exile, effectively ousted from the city he once ruled by near hereditary right. According to the widespread accounts that appear in historical chronicles and references in reputable works, including the New York Times articles, occasionally exploring Florentine history, Savonarola's preaching and fervent following play a decisive role in galvanizing public sentiment against Piero. And thus, almost overnight, the Medici's grip on Florence comes undone. With the Medici out, Savonarola emerges as an unofficial leader in Florence, spearheading a new republican government that tries to anchor itself in religious virtue. While he does not assume political office in the modern sense, his influence over public policy becomes enormous. He encourages laws that reflect what he believes to be Christian purity, and he exhorts citizens to abandon the vanities of secular culture, fine clothing, expensive jewelry, and the sort of lavish artwork that exalted human beauty more than divine grace. By 1497, spurred on by Savonarola's sermons, groups of zealous youth roam the city, collecting sinful objects to be tossed onto massive pyres. These events, memorialized by the term bonfires of the vanities, consume everything from books of poetry and secular manuscripts to paintings that depict mythological scenes Many of these artworks, ironically, had either been commissioned by the Medici or stored in their palaces. This destructive fervor shocks not only modern observers, but also many at the time who see it as an assault on the creative spirit that made Florence so remarkable. Yet for a period, Savonarola stands by his methods, insisting that Florence is destined to become the New Jerusalem if it remains faithful to God's commandments. He views the bonfires as a necessary purgation, a physical enactment of the moral renewal he believes God demands. Citing sources like the contemporary chronicle of Luca Landucci, some references are found in modern blogs dedicated to Renaissance studies, and articles from reputable outlets discussing the cultural impact of these bonfires. Scholars highlight that, while not all Florentines approved, enough were swept up in Savonarola's fervor that these spectacular burnings became public events replete with processions, hymns, and dramatic speeches. The problem for Savonarola arises when he overplays his hand, especially with the papacy. Pope Alexander VI, a Borgia, whose name itself is synonymous with nepotism and political cunning, grows increasingly wary of Savonarola's claims that Florence will be spared God's wrath, while the rest of Italy decays. On multiple occasions, the Pope orders Savonarola to desist from preaching, but the friar, emboldened by popular support, refuses. While Alexander's Sick's motives might have included personal or dynastic interests, he also sees Savonarola's brand of fiery reformism and claims of direct prophecy as a threat to ecclesiastical authority. Documents from the Vatican archives, as well as references from Wikipedia's page on Savonarola, indicate that by 1497, the Pope excommunicates the friar, a serious blow in an era when excommunication could turn the tide of political fortunes overnight. According to Encyclopedia Britannica and other scholarly references, the Medici, though still exiled from Florence, begin to see an opportunity. If Savonarola can be discredited or removed, the ground might be laid for their eventual return. While the Pope's edict alone might have forced many preachers into silence, Savonarola continues defying the papal orders. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Medici agents and their allies in various Italian courts begin discreetly financing efforts to undermine Savonarola's credibility. This could include paying off informants to testify against him, encouraging city officials to turn against him, or simply funneling money to those who might help ensure that when a trial does come, it ends with a damning verdict. Here we see parallels to older episodes of religious power plays. One might think of the Capetian Templar Purge in early 14th century France, where King Philip IV orchestrated the downfall of the Knights Templar through a combination of false charges and cunning political alliances. The difference in Florence is that Savonarola was one man, albeit a charismatic one, and the city's internal politics had grown dangerously polarized. By 1498, public sentiment towards Savonarola shifts. Some Florentines resent the austerity measures, others fear the Pope's anger, and many see the city's finances deteriorate under Savonarola's moral regime, which disrupts traditional trade and investment patterns. In that growing climate of tension, the Florentine government arrests the friar. He faces a brutal series of interrogations and a trial that many historians believe was heavily influenced, if not outright orchestrated, by powerful factions determined to see him fall. Although the exact nature of Medici funding in the trial remains partially veiled in mystery, some documents are incomplete, lost to time, or possibly destroyed. Encyclopedia Britannica notes that there is credible evidence the Medici channeled resources to ensure Savonarola's condemnation. They recognized that once he was removed, Florence would be ripe for a new political order, one in which the Medici could maneuver back into favor. Savonarola, along with two of his closest associates, is found guilty of heresy and sedition. On May 23, 1498, the friars are executed in the Piazza della Signoria, the same public square that had witnessed some of Savonarola's grandest sermons, and ironically, the same space where the bonfires of the Vanities had blazed. According to most chronicles, the men are hanged and then burned, their ashes scattered in the Arno River to prevent the collection of holy relics by ardent followers. Historians, from early modern chroniclers to modern academic analyses, describe it as a particularly symbolic end for a man whose entire public career revolved around purifying the city through fire. In a grim twist, his death by fire effectively cements his transformation from moral preacher to controversial martyr. The city's people, who once cheered his apocalyptic visions, bear witness to the flames that consume his life. After Savonarola's death, the door opens for the Medici to regain influence. It doesn't happen overnight, as Florence grapples with complex alliances and shifting external pressures. However, over the next decade, Medici partisans gradually rebuild their standing. By the early 16th century, with figures like Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, the future Pope Leo II, maneuvering on the European stage, the Medici re-established themselves more firmly than ever, eventually securing the title of Duke of Florence and turning the city into a hereditary domain. The influence of the Pope in making or breaking a local regime had never been clearer, a lesson the Medici took to heart. And in that realignment, the memory of Savonarola becomes somewhat complicated. Some remember him as a prophet who predicted the downfall of corrupt institutions, while others see him as a fanatic who nearly choked Florence's cultural vibrancy. The significance of Savonarola's downfall resonates far beyond the city limits. Martin Luther, for instance, who begins the Protestant Reformation a few decades later, is rumored to have admired Savonarola's courage in standing up to papal excess, though the two men's theological positions differ significantly. Modern scholars still debate just how directly Savonarola's condemnation might have signaled the broader dissatisfaction that would, by the early 16th century, erupt into full-scale religious conflicts throughout Europe. For Florence, though, the friars' demise is a turning point, marking the end of a brief, intense experiment in radical Christian governance and the start of a new era in which the Medici reassert their presence. Regarding the bonfires of the Vanities, the destruction of Medici art is often singled out as the prime example of how fervent Savonarola's followers were. Many of the works burned were not necessarily direct commissions from the Medici, but they belonged to wealthy families who shared a taste for lavish or even pagan-themed art that Savonarola deemed idolatrous. Some modern historians caution that while the most dramatic stories of famous paintings going up in flames could be partly exaggerated, since art historians have trouble tracing exactly which masterpieces were destroyed. Enough eyewitness testimonies exist, some found in letters that still survive in Florentine archives, to confirm that significant amounts of art, books, and luxury items were lost. The entire city underwent a kind of spiritual mania that overshadowed the refined humanist culture championed by Lorenzo de' Medici in previous decades. Still, one critical note remains: although we have strong evidence for the Medici's covert role in Savonarola's downfall, and we know from contemporary documents that money changed hands to ensure his condemnation, the specifics are murky. Original trial transcripts for Savonarola are fragmentary, and interrogations were often carried out under torture, producing confessions that might be questionable. Claims that the Medici orchestrated the public burnings themselves, That they manipulated Savonarola's campaign from the start lacks substantive proof. It is more likely that Savonarola's spiritual and moral convictions were genuine, and that the Medici exploited the situation only when it became advantageous to do so. Just as with the Templar Purge centuries earlier in France, the underlying cause was an uneasy mix of religious fervor and political opportunism, powerful men capitalizing on public sentiment to achieve their ends. But in the day-to-day reality of 1490s, Florence, it was enough that the Medici recognized a golden opportunity to rid themselves of a dangerous foe. If you delve into the surviving Florentine records, you'll find references to suspected payments made to minor officials, notaries, and even certain individuals in the Dominican order who turned a blind eye when the friar was arrested. Blogs and websites dedicated to archival research sometimes publish scans of these documents, though many remain locked away in archives or accessible only by scholarly request. Tracking the flow of funds from the Medici banks, those that had branches across Europe, to local informants in Florence isn't always straightforward. Some historians note that meticulously kept banking records from the Medici era could yield clues, but many ledgers were lost over centuries of upheaval. Yet the consensus stands. The family did not rely solely on public pressure or ecclesiastical decree. They played their part behind the scenes, using wealth and connections to ensure that Savonarola faced the severest possible outcome. In that sense, the downfall of Savonarola is emblematic of how religion and politics interwove in Renaissance Italy. The lines separating spiritual authority from political power were blurred. Popes were often more like princes. Princes sometimes meddled in ecclesiastical appointments, and friars like Savonarola could become kingmakers or kingbreakers if they captured the hearts of the people. In a modern perspective, we might compare it to how influential religious figures can sometimes shape or shift the balance of power in volatile political climates. The difference is that in Renaissance Florence, that interplay took place against a backdrop of looming cathedrals, richly frescoed walls, and fierce family vendettas that could literally decide the fate of a city-state. The memory of Savonarola left a divide among Florentines. Some saw him as a tragic hero, a genuine reformer undone by the corruption of both church and state, while others blamed him for the wave of fanaticism that caused destruction and riled up the city. Writers in the following centuries periodically resurrected Savonarola's story for different ends. Protestants cast him as a proto-martyr who challenged papal authority. Counter-Reformation Catholics pointed to him as a cautionary tale about radical preachers. Modern historians, sifting through the complexities of the era, tend to see him as a man consumed by an authentic spiritual vision, yet too entangled in temporal politics to avoid the traps of realpolitik, especially in a city as cunning and faction-ridden as Florence. Today, the remnants of Savonarola's story remain visible in Florence, if you know where to look. The spot in the Piazza della Signoria where he was executed is sometimes marked with a plaque or circular sign on the pavement, reminding passers-by that this vibrant public square once served as a stage for both the friar's triumph and his downfall. Museums sometimes display pieces of art saved from or associated with the bonfires of the vanities, accompanied by plaques explaining the destructive wave that nearly wiped out entire genres of Renaissance creativity. And in the convent of San Marco, where Savonarola once preached, you can see the cells and chapels that house the frescoes of Fra Angelico, paintings that radiate a spiritual intensity. One can only imagine how Savonarola must have felt, surrounded by such beauty. yet convinced that Florence's salvation required casting aside many worldly attachments.